in the penal colony.
"It's a singular apparatus," the officer said to the explorer, running his somewhat admiring eyes over the apparatus with which he was after all familiar. The traveler seemed to have accepted the invitation purely out of courtesy. The commander had asked him to attend the execution of a soldier, who had been condemned to death for insubordination and for insulting a superior. There probably wasn't all that much interest in this execution, even within the penal colony. At least, here in this deep, sandy valley, which was closed in by naked slopes on all sides, the only people present, aside from the officer and the traveler, were the condemned man, an obtuse person with a broad mouth and seedy hair and face, and a soldier clutching the heavy shackle with the small, interconnected chains that fettered the condemned man's ankles, wrists, and neck. At any rate, the condemned man looked so dog-like and cringing that they could, no doubt, have let him run free over the slopes, and would have needed only to whistle for him to come at the beginning of the execution. The traveler had little interest in the apparatus, and was almost visibly unconcerned as he walked up and down behind the condemned man, while the officer took care of the final adjustments, crawling underneath the apparatus, which was inserted deep in the ground, or scaling a ladder to examine the upper parts. These were chores that could have actually been left to a mechanic, but the officer performed them with great zeal, either because he was a strong supporter of this apparatus, or because there were other reasons why the job could not have been entrusted to anyone else. "It's all set," he finally called, and climbed down the ladder. He was extremely worn out, breathed with his mouth wide open, and had two delicate ladies' handkerchiefs tucked in behind his uniform collar. "These uniforms must be far too heavy for the tropics," the traveler said, instead of inquiring about the apparatus, as the officer had expected. "True enough," said the officer, washing his greasy, oily hands in a pail of water that stood ready. "But they represent our homeland, and we do not want to lose our homeland. But now look at this apparatus," he promptly added, drying his hands with a towel while simultaneously motioning toward the apparatus. "Up to this point, it requires manual labor, but from now on, the apparatus works automatically." The traveler nodded and followed him. The officer, seeking to protect himself against all contingencies, then said, "Naturally, malfunctions do occur, but while I hope we won't have any today, they must be reckoned with. After all, the apparatus has to keep working uninterruptedly for 12 hours. If malfunctions do occur, however, they are very minor, and they can be dealt with immediately. Won't you sit down?" he finally asked, pulling out a cane chair from a whole pile of them and offering it to the traveler. The latter could not refuse. He now sat at the edge of a pit, into which he fleetingly glanced. It wasn't very deep. On one side of the pit, the excavated soil was heaped up into an embankment. On the other side stood the apparatus. "I don't know," said the officer, "whether the commander has already filled you in about the apparatus." The traveler gestured vaguely. The officer could ask for nothing better, since now he could explain the apparatus himself. "This apparatus," he said, grasping a crank handle and leaning against it, "was invented by our former commander. I assisted in the very first tests, and I was involved in all the work until it was perfected. However, he alone deserves the credit for the invention. Have you heard about our former commander? No? Well, I'm not exaggerating when I say that the entire setup of the penal colony is his achievement. By the time he died, we, his friends, already knew that the colony, as he had organized it, was so self-contained that it would take his successor many years to change anything, even if he had 1,000 plans in mind. And our prediction was correct. The new commander was forced to realize it. Too bad you never met the old commander. But, the officer interrupted himself, I'm rattling on, and his apparatus is standing here in front of us. It consists, as you can see, of 3 parts. Over the years, a popular nickname has developed for each of these parts. The lower part is called the bed, the upper one the draftsman, and the middle one floating here is called the harrow. "The harrow?" asked the traveler. He hadn't been listening very closely. The sun was entangled all too deeply in the shadeless valley. It was hard to focus one's thoughts. Thus, the officer, in his tight, full-dress tunic, which was weighed down with epaulets and loaded with piping, struck him as all the more admirable, so eagerly explaining his subject, and also, while speaking, applying a screwdriver to an occasional screw. The soldier appeared to be in the same frame of mind as the traveler. The chain attached to the condemned man was wound about both the soldier's wrists. His one hand was propped on his rifle, his head was drooping at the neck, and he was utterly indifferent. The traveler was not surprised, for the officer was speaking French, and, presumably, neither the soldier nor the condemned man understood French. It was therefore all the more striking that the condemned man nevertheless made an effort to follow the officer's explanations. With a kind of sleepy obstinacy, he kept peering at whatever the officer happened to be showing. And when the traveler now interrupted him with a question, the condemned man, just like the officer, looked at the traveler. "Yes, the harrow," said the officer. "The name fits. The needles are arranged like the teeth in a harrow, and the whole thing is handled like a harrow, though it acts in only one place, and far more skillfully. Anyhow, you'll understand it right away. The condemned man is laid out here on the bed. You see, first I want to describe the apparatus, and only then set the procedure in motion. You'll be able to follow it better. Besides, one cog in the draftsman is ground down far too much. It squeaks loudly when it's running. You can barely communicate. Unfortunately, it's hard getting spare parts here. Well, here's the bed, as I've pointed out. It's fully padded with a layer of cotton. You'll soon find out why. The condemned man is put belly down on this cotton, naked, of course. We have straps to tie him in, here for his hands, here for his feet, here for his neck. And here, at the top of the bed, where the man, as I have said, lies face down, we have this small felt stump, which can be easily regulated so that it pushes precisely into the man's mouth. Its purpose is to prevent him from screaming and from chewing up his tongue. Naturally, he has to take in the felt, otherwise the neck strap will break his neck. "This is cotton?" asked the traveler, bending forward. "Yes, certainly," said the officer with a smile. "Feel it for yourself." He took the traveler's hand and guided it across the bed. "It's a specially prepared cotton. That's why it looks so unusual. I'll get back to its purpose later on." The traveler now felt a slight interest in the apparatus. Shading his eyes with one hand to protect them from the sun, he peered up the side of the structure. It was huge. The bed and the draftsman were of equal size and looked like 2 dark chests. The draftsman was installed almost 7 feet above the bed. Their corners were linked by 4 brass rods that practically radiated in the sunlight. Between the chests, the harrow shuttled on a steel band. The officer had barely noticed the traveler's earlier indifference, but he was alive to his now budding interest. That was why he broke off his explanations, to give the traveler time for undisturbed study. The condemned man imitated the traveler. Since he couldn't shade his eyes with his hand, they squinted upward, uncovered. "So now the man is lying there," said the traveler, leaning back in his chair and crossing his legs. "Yes," said the officer, pushing his cap back slightly and running his hand over his hot face. "Now, listen. Both the bed and the draftsman have an electric battery each. The bed needs one for itself. The draftsman needs one for the harrow. Once the man is strapped tight, the bed is set in motion. It quivers in tiny, very rapid twitches, both sideways and up and down. You must have seen similar apparatuses in sanitariums, except that in our bed all the movements are precisely calculated. You see, they have to be meticulously geared to the motions of the harrow. But this harrow has the job of actually carrying out the judgment." "Just what is the judgment?" asked the traveler. "You don't know even that?" said the astounded officer, then bit his lip. "Please forgive me if my explanations are unsystematic. I apologize from the bottom of my heart. You see, it was the commander who used to provide the explanations, but the new commander has backed out of this honorary obligation. Although his failure to inform such an important visitor—" The traveler tried to ward off the tribute with both hands, but the officer insisted on his wording. "Such an important visitor about even the form of our judgment is a further new development that—" He had some strong words on the tip of his tongue, but, checking himself, merely said, "I was not informed. I am not the guilty one. Still and all, I am the person most capable of explaining our modes of judgment, for I have on me," he patted his breast pocket, "the pertinent designs hand-drawn by the former commander." "The commander's own hand-drawn designs?" asked the traveler. "Did he wear all those hats? Was he a soldier, a judge, an engineer, a chemist, a draftsman?" "Yes, indeed," said the officer, nodding, with a thoughtful, glassy stare. Then he scrutinized his hands. He didn't find them clean enough to touch the drawings, so he walked over to the pail and washed them again. Then he produced a small leather portfolio, saying, "Our judgment does not sound severe. The commandment that the condemned man has broken is written on his body by the harrow. For instance, on this condemned man's body," the officer pointed at him, "the harrow is to write, 'Honor thy superior.'" The traveler glanced casually at the man, who, when pointed at by the officer, had kept his head lowered and now seemed to be all ears, trying to catch something. But the movements of his pressed, pouting lips made it obvious that he could understand nothing. The traveler had wanted to put various questions to the officer, but at the sight of the condemned man, asked only, "Does he know his judgment?" "No," said the officer, about to continue his explanations. But the traveler broke in, "He doesn't know his own judgment?" "No," the officer repeated, pausing for an instant, as if demanding a more detailed explanation of the question. The officer then said, It would be no use informing him. He's going to experience it on his body anyway." The traveler wanted to hold his tongue, but he felt the condemned man staring at him. He seemed to be asking whether the traveler could approve of the described procedure. That was why the traveler, who had already leaned back in his chair, now bent forward again and asked, "But he does know that he has been condemned?" "No, again," said the officer, smiling at the traveler as if expecting further bizarre revelations from him. "No," said the traveler, rubbing his forehead. "Then the man doesn't yet know how his defense was received?" "He had no opportunity to defend himself," said the officer, looking sideways as if talking to himself and not caring to embarrass the traveler by telling him about these self-evident matters. "He must have had an opportunity to defend himself," said the traveler, rising from the chair. The officer realized he was in danger of delaying his explanation of the apparatus for a long time. So he went over to the traveler, took him by the arm, and motioned toward the condemned man who, now that he was so obviously the center of attention, pulled himself up rigidly. The soldier had also yanked on the chain. "This is how things stand," said the officer. "I have been appointed judge here in the penal colony, despite my youth. For I assisted the former commander in all criminal matters, and I am also the person most familiar with the apparatus. The principle on which I base my decisions is, guilt is always beyond doubt. Other courts of law cannot follow this principle, for they consist of many people, and they also have higher courts over them. But this is not the case here, or at least it wasn't the case under the former commander. The new one, to be sure, has shown some desire to interfere in my court, but so far I have managed to hold him at bay, and I will keep managing to do so. You wanted an explanation of this case. It is as simple as any other case. This man was assigned to a captain as his orderly and slept outside his door. But this morning the captain brought charges against him for sleeping while on duty. You see, he has standing orders to get up at the stroke of each hour and salute outside the captain's door. Certainly not a hard task, but an important one, for he is to remain alert both as a sentry and as an orderly. Last night, the captain wanted to check whether the man was performing his duty. At the stroke of 2, he opened the door and found him curled up asleep. He got his riding crop and lashed the man's face. Instead of standing up and asking his forgiveness, the man grabbed his superior's legs, shook him, and yelled, "Throw away that crop or I'll eat you alive." Those are the facts of the case. The captain came to see me 1 hour ago. I wrote down his statement and then appended the judgment. Next, I had the man put in chains. It was all quite simple. Had I first summoned the man and questioned him, it would have brought nothing but confusion. He would have lied, and once I had exposed his lies, he would have piled on new lies, and so forth. But now I've got him, and I'll never let him go. Is everything clarified? But we're wasting time. The execution should have started by now, and I still haven't finished explaining the apparatus. He pressed the traveler back down on the chair, returned to the apparatus, and began. As you can see, the harrows correspond to the human shape. This is the harrow for the upper body. These are the harrows for the legs. This tiny spike is all that's used for the head. Is that clear? He leaned amiably toward the traveler, ready to launch into the most comprehensive explanations. The traveler frowned at the harrow. He had not been satisfied with the information on the judicial procedure. Nevertheless, he had to remind himself that this was a penal colony, that unusual measures were needed here, and that they had to resort to even the most stringent military discipline. However, he also pinned some hope on the new commander, who evidently planned to introduce, though gradually, a new procedure that was simply beyond the officer's narrow grasp. It was this train of thought that led the traveler to ask, "Will the commander be attending the execution?" "It's not certain," said the officer, embarrassed by the abrupt question, and his friendly expression became distorted. "That's precisely why we have to hurry. Much as I regret it, I'll have to shorten my explanations. But tomorrow, of course, when the apparatus has been cleaned, its only failing is that it gets so dirty. I can go into greater detail. For now, just the bare gist. When the man lies on the bed, and the bed begins to quiver, the harrow is lowered upon the body. It automatically adjusts itself so that its points just barely graze the skin. Once it's in place, this steel cable instantly stiffens into a rigid band. And now the performance begins. An outsider won't notice any external difference between the punishments. The harrow seems to work identically. As it quivers, it sticks its points into the body, which, moreover, quivers with the bed. Now, to enable anyone to check the progress of the judgment, the harrow is made of glass. Attaching the needles involved some technical difficulties, but we succeeded after a lot of trial and error. We simply spared no effort. And now, everyone can see through the glass and watch the inscription emerging on the body. Won't you come closer and look at the needles?" The traveler slowly rose, walked across, and bent over the harrow. "You can see," said the officer, "two kinds of needles in multiple patterns. Each long needle is accompanied by a short one. The long one does the writing, and the short one spurts out water to wash away the blood and to keep the writing clear. The mixture of blood and water is then channeled into tiny runnels and eventually flows into the main gutter, from where the drain pipe leads to the pit." The officer pointed out the precise route that the mixture had to take. When, in order to make it as graphic as possible, he pretended to scoop up the liquid with both hands at the mouth of the drain pipe, the traveler raised his head and, groping backwards with one hand, tried to return to his chair. But then, to his horror, he saw that the condemned man had likewise followed the officer's invitation to look closely at the way the harrow was set up. The condemned man had tugged the drowsy soldier slightly forward by his chain and was also bending over the glass. One could see that his uncertain eyes were seeking what the two gentlemen had just observed, but that he would fail since he hadn't heard the explanation. He kept bending every which way. His eyes kept scurrying over the glass. The traveler wanted to drive him away, for what he was doing must have been punishable. But with one hand the officer held on to the traveler, and with the other hand he took a clod of soil from the embankment and threw it at the soldier. The soldier's head jolted up. Upon seeing what the condemned man had dared to do, he dropped the rifle, dug his heels into the ground, and yanked the condemned man back so hard that he instantly fell down. The soldier then watched him, writhing and rattling his chains. "Get him on his feet," the officer yelled, for he noticed that the traveler was being all too greatly distracted by the condemned man. The traveler even leaned across the harrow, paying it no heed, trying only to determine what was happening to the condemned man. "Treat him carefully," the officer again yelled. He hurried around the apparatus, grabbed the condemned man under the shoulders, and, with the soldier's help, got him back on his feet, which, however, kept slipping. "Now I know everything," said the traveler when the officer came back to him. "Except the most important part," said the officer, grabbing the traveler's arm and pointing upward. "Up there, in the draftsman, you'll find the gear unit that controls the movements of the harrow. Now, this unit is regulated according to the design prescribed by the judgment. I still use the former commander's drawings. Here they are." He pulled a few pages from the leather portfolio. "Unfortunately, I can't let you handle them. They are my most precious possessions. Sit down. I'll hold them up to you from here. Then you'll be able to see everything clearly." He showed him the first sheet. The traveler would have liked to express his appreciation, but all he could see was a crisscross of labyrinthine lines covering the paper so densely that the blank gaps were barely discernible. "Read it," said the officer. "I can't," said the traveler. "But it's quite legible," said the officer. "It's very intricate," said the traveler evasively, "but I can't decipher it." "Yes," said the officer, laughing and putting the portfolio away. "It's no calligraphy for schoolchildren. It has to be studied for a long time. Eventually, you'd be able to make it out, too. It can't be a simple script, of course. After all, it's not supposed to kill right away. It's planned for an average of 12 hours. The climax is calculated for the 6th hour. So lots and lots of curlicues have to surround the actual script. The script itself forms only a narrow belt around the body. The rest of the skin is reserved for embellishments. Can you now appreciate the work of the harrow and the entire apparatus? Just look." He bounded up the ladder, turned a wheel, called down, "Watch out! Step aside!" and everything started moving. If the cog hadn't squeaked, it would have been wonderful. As if surprised by this troublesome cog, the officer shook his fist, then, by way of apology, held out his arms to the traveler, and hastily clambered down in order to observe the workings of the apparatus from below. Something was still amiss, which he alone noticed. He climbed up again, thrust both hands into the draftsman, then, in order to descend more quickly, he slid down the pole instead of using the ladder, and, trying to make himself heard above the racket, yelled into the traveler's ear at the top of his lungs, "Do you understand the procedure? The harrow starts writing. Once it's applied, the first round of script to the man's back, the layer of cotton slowly rolls the man over on his side to offer the harrow new space. Meanwhile, the raw areas wounded by the script gradually move into the cotton, which, because of its special treatment, immediately staunches the bleeding and prepares the body for deeper penetration by the script. Here, when the body is rolled over again, the teeth along the edge of the harrow rip the cotton from the wounds, hurl it into the pit, and the harrow then has more work. And so it keeps writing deeper and deeper for those 12 hours. During the first 6 hours, the condemned man remains alive almost as before. He only suffers pain. The felt is removed after 2 hours, for the man has no strength left for screaming. Here, at the head end, warm rice pudding is placed in this electrically heated basin, and if he likes, the man can take whatever he manages to lap up with his tongue. No man ignores the opportunity. I know of no one, and I've had lots of experience. He doesn't lose his pleasure in eating until the 6th hour. Usually I then kneel down here and observe this phenomenon. The man seldom swallows the last morsel. He merely rolls it in his mouth and spits it out into the pit. At that point, I have to duck. Otherwise, it would hit me in the face. and how quiet the man becomes at the 6th hour. Even the stupidest man is now enlightened. It starts around the eyes. From there it spreads out. A look that might lure you into joining him under the harrow. Nothing else happens. The man simply begins to decipher the writing. He purses his lips as if he were listening. You've seen that it's not easy deciphering the script with your eyes. But our man deciphers it with his wounds. It's a lot of work, to be sure. It takes him 6 hours to complete it. But then the harrow forks up his entire body and dumps him into the pit, where he flops down on the cotton and the bloody water. Now the judicial procedure is over, and we, I and the soldier, bury him quickly." The traveler had lowered his ear toward the officer and, with his hands in his coat pockets, was watching the machine working. The condemned man was also watching it, but without comprehending. He was bent forward slightly, following the reeling needles, when the soldier, at a sign from the officer, took a knife and slashed the back of the man's shirt and trousers so that they dropped off. He tried to grab his falling clothes to cover his nakedness, but the soldier lifted him up and shook off his final rags. The officer switched off the machine, and in a sudden hush the condemned man was laid out under the harrow. The chains were loosened, and the straps fastened in their stead. In the first moment, it seemed almost a relief for the condemned man. And now the harrow came down a bit, for he was a thin man. When the needle points touched him, a shudder ran over his skin. While the soldier was busy strapping in his right hand, he stretched out his left hand, not knowing where. But it was toward where the traveler was standing. The officer kept gazing at the traveler from the side, probing his face as if to read the effect made on him by the execution, which he had at least outlined for him. The wrist strap tore. The soldier must have drawn it too tight. The officer had to step in. The soldier showed him the torn-off scrap. The officer walked over to him and said, facing the traveler, "The machine is extremely intricate. Something is bound to rip or break now and then. But that shouldn't interfere with one's overall opinion. Anyway, the strap can be replaced immediately. I'll use a chain. Of course, it will interfere with the delicacy of the vibrations for the right arm." And while fastening the chains, he added, "The wherewithal for maintaining the machine is greatly reduced now. The former commander granted me an unlimited budget for this sole purpose. We had a depot here, where all possible spare parts were stored. I confess I was practically a spendthrift. I mean earlier, not now, as the new commander claims. He uses anything as a pretext for battling old institutions. Now he oversees the machine budget himself, and if I order a new strap, the torn one is demanded as evidence. It takes 10 days for the replacement to arrive, but it's an inferior brand and not worth much. And meanwhile, no one cares how I'm supposed to run the machine without a strap." The traveler pondered. It's always risky, interfering decisively in other people's business. He was a citizen of neither the penal colony nor the country it belonged to. If he were to condemn or even obstruct this execution, he might be told, "You're a foreigner, keep quiet." He couldn't have responded to that. He could only have added that he was surprised at himself in this case, for he traveled purely with the goal of observing, but in no way altering, judicial methods in other countries. Of course, the situation here was highly tempting. The injustice of the procedure and the inhumanity of the execution were beyond all doubt. No one could assume any self-serving motives on the traveler's part, for the condemned man was a stranger to him, a foreigner, and no one he sympathized with. The traveler himself had letters of recommendation from high places. had been welcomed here with great cordiality, and his being invited to this execution even seemed to indicate that they were asking his opinion about this legal action. And this was all the more probable, in that the commander, as the traveler had now heard loud and clear, was no supporter of this procedure, and was almost hostile toward the officer. Suddenly the traveler heard a shriek of rage from the officer. He had just shoved the felt stump into the condemned man's mouth, not without some effort, when the man, unable to fight his nausea, had shut his eyes and vomited. The officer hastily pulled him up from the stump, and was about to turn the man's head toward the pit, but it was too late. The vomit was already flowing down into the machine. "It's all the commander's fault!" the officer shouted, and in his daze he shook the brass rods in front. "My machine is being soiled like a stable!" With trembling hands, he showed the traveler what had happened. "Haven't I spent hours at a time trying to make the commander understand that no food should be served to the condemned man a whole day before the execution? But our new mild policy reflects a different attitude. The commander's ladies stuff the man's belly with sweets before he's taken away. All his life he's eaten nothing but stinking fish, and now he has to eat sweets. Still, it could be possible, I would not object, but why don't they get a new felt gag, which I've been requesting for the last 3 months? How can a man help feeling nauseated when he gets that felt into his mouth after over 100 men have sucked and gnawed on it while dying?" The condemned man had laid down his head, and he looked peaceful. The soldier was busy cleaning the machine with the man's shirt. The officer went over to the traveler, who, with some vague foreboding, stepped back. But the officer grabbed his hand and pulled him aside. "I want to speak to you privately," he said. "May I?" "By all means," said the traveler, listening with downcast eyes. "At present, this procedure and this execution, which you now have a chance to admire, no longer have any open supporters in the colony. I am their sole representative, and, simultaneously, the sole representative of the old commander's legacy. I can't even think of expanding the procedure any further. It takes all my energy just to preserve it as is. When the old commander was alive, the colony was full of his supporters. To some extent I have the old commander's persuasiveness, but I entirely lack his power. As a result, his supporters have kept a low profile. There are lots of them left, but nobody admits it. If you go to the tea-house today, during an execution, that is, and keep your ears open, you may hear some ambiguous remarks. Those people are all supporters, but under the current commander and with his current views, they're completely useless to me. And now I ask you, should such a life's work," he pointed at the machine, "perish because of this commander and his women who influence him? Should one put up with this, even if one is only a foreigner visiting our island for a few days? But there's no time to lose. They're preparing some action against my judicial authority. Talks are already taking place at the commander's headquarters without my being allowed to attend. Even your visit today strikes me as characteristic of the entire situation. They're cowards, and so they send you, a foreigner, ahead. How different the executions used to be. The entire valley was mobbed a whole day in advance. They all came just to watch. Early in the morning, the commander showed up with his ladies. Fanfares awoke the entire camp. I reported that everything was ready. The company, no high official dared to be absent, grouped around the machine. This heap of cane chairs is a wretched leftover from that era. The machine was freshly polished and glistening. I used new replacement parts for almost every execution. In front of 100 eyes, All the spectators stood on tiptoe as far as the hills. The commander himself placed the condemned man under the harrow. Something that a common soldier may do today was assigned to me, the presiding judge, and it was an honor for me. And now the execution began. No jarring note disturbed the running of the machine. Some people stopped watching altogether. They lay in the sand, closing their eyes. Everyone knew justice was being done. In the hush, all we heard was the condemned man's sighs, muffled by the felt gag. Today, the machine no longer succeeds in wringing a louder sigh from the condemned man than the felt gag can throttle. But back then, the writing needles emitted a mordant liquid, which we are not allowed to use anymore. Well, and then came the 6th hour. It was impossible to allow everyone who requested it to watch from up close. The commander, wise as he was, ordered that preference be given to the children. I, however, because of my profession, was always permitted to stand close by. I would often squat there with a small child in each arm, right and left. How profoundly we took in the transfigured expression from the tortured face. How intensely our cheeks basked in the glow of that justice, attained at long last and already fading. What wonderful times, my friend. The officer had obviously forgotten whom he was dealing with. He had thrown his arms around the traveler and placed his head on his shoulder. The traveler was deeply embarrassed. He gazed impatiently over the officer's head. The soldier had finished the clean-up work and had now poured some rice pudding from a can into the basin. No sooner did the condemned man, who seemed to have recovered completely, notice the pudding than his tongue began snapping at it. The soldier kept shoving him away, for the pudding was probably meant for some later time, but in any case it was equally unbecoming of the soldier to reach into it with his dirty hands and eat it in front of the ravenous prisoner. The officer quickly pulled himself together. "I didn't mean to touch you," he told the traveler. "I know it's impossible to make those times comprehensible today. Anyway, the machine is still running, and it still works on its own. It works on its own even when it's alone in this valley. And ultimately, the corpse, in an incomprehensibly gentle flight, still drops into the pit, even if hundreds of people no longer gather round the pit like flies, as they used to do. Back then, we had to install a sturdy railing around the pit, but it was torn down long ago." The traveler, wanting to get his face away from the officer, glanced about aimlessly. The officer assumed he was contemplating the desolation of the valley. He therefore took hold of the traveler's hands, circled around him to meet his eyes, and asked, "Are you aware of the disgrace?" But the traveler held his tongue. The officer left off him for a brief while. With legs apart, hands on hips, he stood silently, gazing at the ground. Then, with an encouraging smile, he said, "I was near you yesterday when the commander invited you. I heard the invitation. I know the commander. I instantly understood what he was up to. Even though he has enough power to take action against me, he doesn't dare as yet. But he does want to expose me to your judgment, that of a distinguished foreigner. He is meticulous in his calculations. This is your second day on the island. You didn't know the old commander or his ideas. You are trapped in European attitudes. Perhaps you're opposed on principle to capital punishment in general, and this kind of mechanical execution in particular. Furthermore, you watch the execution take place without public participation, dismally on a somewhat defective machine. Given all these things, would it not, the commander thinks, be highly possible that you do not consider my procedure appropriate? And if you do not consider it appropriate, you will not, I am still speaking from the commander's point of view, hold back your opinion, for you must certainly rely on your tried and tested convictions. True, you have gotten to know and respect many peculiarities of many nations. You will therefore probably not state your wholehearted opposition to this procedure as you might in your own country. But the commander doesn't even need that. A casual, a simply careless word would be enough. It doesn't have to express your conviction so long as it merely seems to comply with his wishes, and he will question you very insidiously, of that I am certain. And his ladies will sit around in a circle and prick up their ears. You will say something like, "In my country, a judicial procedure is different," or "In my country, the defendant is interrogated before the verdict," or "In my country, the condemned man is informed of the verdict," or "In my country, there are other forms of punishment besides capital punishment," or "In my country, torture existed only in the Middle Ages." Those are all remarks that are as correct as they may sound natural to you. Innocent remarks that do not discredit my procedure. But how will the commander receive them? I can see him, the good commander, instantly shoving his chair aside and hurrying out to the balcony. I can see his ladies thronging after him. I can hear his voice now. The ladies call it a thunderous voice. And he says, "A great researcher of Western civilization, assigned to investigate judicial operations in all countries, has just said that our procedure, an old custom, is inhumane. With this verdict from such a personage, it is naturally no longer possible for me to tolerate this procedure. As of today, I therefore order, etc." You try to cut in. You did not say what he is proclaiming. You did not call my procedure inhumane. Quite the contrary. On the basis of your deep understanding, you regard it as thoroughly humane and human. You also admire this machinery. But it's too late. You don't even get out on the balcony, which is already crowded with ladies. You try to draw attention, you try to shout, but a lady's hand covers your mouth. And I, and the old commander's work, are doomed. The traveler had to suppress a smile. So the task he had thought so hard was that easy. He said evasively, "You overestimate my influence. The commander has read my letter of recommendation. He knows I am no expert in judicial proceedings. Were I to express my opinion, it would be that of a private individual, no more significant than anyone else's opinion, and in any case far more insignificant than the opinion of the commander, who, as I am led to believe, has very far-reaching powers in this penal colony. Now, if his opinion is as firmly set as you believe, then I fear that the end has come for this procedure, with no need for my modest help." Did the officer see the light? No, not yet. He emphatically shook his head and glanced back at the condemned man and the soldier, both of whom flinched and stopped eating the rice. Then the officer walked up very close to the traveler, looked at something on his jacket instead of at his face, and said more softly than before, "You don't know the commander. You are, please excuse the expression, somewhat innocent in regard to him and, indeed, all of us. Your influence, believe me, cannot be assessed high enough. Why, I was in seventh heaven when I heard that you would be attending the execution all by yourself. This order from the commander was aimed at me, but I will now turn it to my advantage. Undiverted by false insinuations and scornful looks, which could not have been avoided if a greater audience had come to the execution, you have heard my explanations, viewed the machine, and are now about to watch the execution. Your verdict must already be formed. Should you feel any minor uncertainties, then the sight of the execution will eliminate them. And now, let me request something of you. Please help me in regard to the commander." The traveler did not let him continue. "How could I?" he exclaimed. "That's quite impossible. I can help you as little as I can harm you." "You can," said the officer. With some dread, the traveler saw the officer clenching his fists. "You can," the officer repeated more urgently. "I have a plan that is sure to work. You believe that your influence does not suffice. I believe that it does suffice. But even granting that you are right, is it not necessary to try anything, even something that may be insufficient, in order to preserve this procedure? So then listen to my plan. For me to carry it out, the most essential thing today is that in the colony you conceal your verdict on the procedure as much as possible. If you are not asked outright, you must say nothing at all. And your statements must be brief and vague. People should notice that it is hard for you to speak about it, that you are embittered, that, in case you should talk openly, you would absolutely swear and curse. I am not asking you to lie, not on your life. But your answers should be brief. Say, 'Yes, I watched the execution,' or 'Yes, I heard all the explanations.' Just that, nothing more. There are reasons enough, though not what the commander may think, for the embitterment that people will notice in you. Naturally, he will misunderstand it altogether and construe it by his lights. That is the basis of my plan. Tomorrow, at his headquarters, the commander will preside over a major conference of all the higher administrative officials. Naturally, the commander knows how to turn such a meeting into a public spectacle. A gallery was built, and it is always packed with spectators. I am forced to take part in the conferences, but I shake with disgust. Now, you are bound to be invited to the session in any case. If you act in accordance with my plan, the invitation will become an urgent plea. But if for some unfathomable reason you are not invited, then you have to request an invitation. You will then receive one beyond any doubt. Thus, tomorrow, you will be sitting with the ladies in the commander's box. He will frequently glance up to make sure you are there. After various indifferent, ridiculous agenda items discussed purely for the audience's benefit, and mostly concerning harbor construction. Always that harbor construction! The issue of the judicial procedure will be raised. If it is not brought up by the commander, or not soon enough, then I will see to it that it is brought up. I will get to my feet and deliver my report on today's execution. Very briefly, just this report. Such a report is not usual there, but I will deliver it anyway. The commander will thank me, as always, with a friendly smile. And now he cannot hold back. He will seize the favorable opportunity. The report, he will speak like that, more or less, on the execution has just been delivered. I would like to add to this report only that this execution was witnessed by the great explorer who, as you all know, has been paying us the extraordinary honor of visiting our colony. Our meeting today has likewise been made more important by his presence. Should we not ask this great explorer what he thinks of the old traditional mode of execution and the preliminary procedure? Naturally, there will be applause everywhere, general concurrence. I will be the loudest. The commander will bow to you and say, "Then I shall ask you on behalf of us all." And now you will step over to the railing. Put your hands down so they will be visible to everyone, otherwise the ladies will grab them and play with your fingers. And now you finally take the floor. I don't know how I will endure the suspense of waiting until then. You must put no restraints on your speech. Blast out the truth. Lean over the railing. Yell, yes, indeed, yell your opinion, your unshakable opinion at the commander. But perhaps you don't wish to. It's not in your character. People in your country may act differently in such situations. Well, that's all right, too. That suffices fully. Don't stand up. Just say a few words. Whisper them so that only the officials below you just barely catch them. That will suffice. You do not have to talk about the poor turnout for the execution, about the squeaking gear, the torn strap, the repulsive felt gag. No, I will take over for you. And believe me, if my speech does not drive him from the hall, then it will force him to his knees, and he will have to avow, "Old Commander, I bow to you." That is my plan. Do you want to help me carry it out? But naturally you want to. More than that, you have to. And the officer grabbed both the traveler's arms and peered, heavily breathing, into his face. He had shouted the last few sentences so loudly that even the soldier and the condemned man had taken notice. Although they understood nothing, they stopped eating and gazed over at the traveler while chewing. From the very outset, the traveler had no doubt about the answer he had to give. He had experienced too much in his life to waver here. He was basically honest and unafraid. Nonetheless, within sight of the soldier and the condemned man, he now hesitated for a heartbeat. Finally, however, he said, as he had to, "No." The officer blinked several times, but did not avert his eyes. "Would you like an explanation?" asked the traveler. The officer nodded mutely. "I oppose this procedure," the traveler now said. "Even before you took me into your confidence. Naturally, I will never betray this confidence under any circumstances. I was already wondering if I had the right to intervene against this procedure, and if my intervention could have even a tiny prospect of success. It was clear to me whom I should turn to first, the commander, of course. You made it clearer to me, but without hardening my resolution. On the contrary, your sincere conviction is touching, even though it cannot deter me." The officer remained mute, turned to the machine, clutched one of the brass rods, and then, leaning back slightly, looked up at the draftsman as if checking whether everything was in order. The soldier and the condemned man seemed to have made friends with one another. The condemned man, difficult as it was because of the tight straps, made signs at the soldier. The soldier bent toward him. The condemned man whispered something, and the soldier nodded. The traveler went after the officer, saying, "You don't yet know what I intend to do. I will give the commander my opinion of the procedure, but privately, and not in a meeting. Nor will I be staying here long enough to be called in for any kind of meeting. I am sailing tomorrow morning, or at least boarding ship." It did not look as if the officer had listened. "So, the procedure has not convinced you?" he said to himself, smiling the way an old man smiles at a child's nonsense, but hides his true thoughts behind the smile. "Well, then, it's time," he finally said, and his clear eyes, which contained some kind of challenge, some kind of appeal for cooperation, suddenly rested on the traveler. "Time for what?" asked the traveler nervously, but received no answer. "You are free," said the officer to the condemned man in his native language. The condemned did not believe it right off. "Well, you're free," said the officer. For the first time, life actually came into the condemned man's face. Was it true? Was it merely a passing whim for the officer? Had the foreign traveler obtained clemency for him? What was it? That was what his face seemed to be asking. But not for long. Whatever it might be, he wanted, if he were allowed, to be really free, and he began struggling to the extent that the harrow permitted. "You're ripping my straps!" shouted the officer. "Lie still! We're unbuckling them!" And together with the soldier to whom he signaled, he got to work. The condemned man laughed to himself wordlessly. He kept turning his face alternately left toward the officer and right toward the soldier, nor did he forget the traveler. "Pull him out," the officer ordered the soldier. Care had to be taken on account of the harrow. Because of the condemned man's impatience, there were already a few small rips in his back. But from now on, the officer paid him scant heed. He walked over to the traveler, pulled out his small leather portfolio again, leafed through the papers, finally located the page he was seeking, and showed it to the traveler. "Read this," he said. "I can't," said the traveler. "I've already told you I can't read this." "Just take a close look at the page," said the officer, stepping nearer to the traveler in order to read with him. But when that did not help either, then, as if the page must not be touched no matter what, he raised his little finger and moved it high across the paper to make it easier for the traveler to read. The traveler also made an effort to at least accommodate the officer, but it was impossible. Now the officer began to spell out the inscription, and then he read out the words, "Be just. That is what it says," he said. "Now you can read it." The traveler bent so close to the paper that the officer, fearing any touch, pulled it further away. The traveler said nothing now, but it was obvious that he still could not read it. "Be just. That's what it says," the officer repeated. "Could be," said the traveler. "I believe that that is what it says." "Fine," said the officer, at least partly satisfied, and climbed the ladder with the page. He very carefully bedded the page in the draftsman, and apparently readjusted the gears entirely. It was very arduous work. Some of the gears must have been very tiny. The officer had to examine the gear unit so precisely that at times his head vanished completely inside the draftsman. The traveler uninterruptedly watched this work from below. His neck grew stiff, and his eyes smarted because the sky was streaming with sunlight. The soldier and the condemned man were occupied only with each other. The condemned man's shirt and trousers, already lying in the pit, were fished out on the point of the soldier's bayonet. The shirt was dreadfully filthy, and the condemned man washed it in the pail of water. When he then put on his shirt and trousers, both the soldier and the condemned man burst into loud guffaws because the backs of the garments were sliced in half. Perhaps the condemned man felt obliged to entertain the soldier. In his slashed clothes, he turned all around in front of the soldier, who squatted on the ground, laughing and slapping his knees. Nevertheless, they did restrain themselves, out of deference to the gentlemen. When the officer was eventually done up above, he smiled as he once more surveyed the whole apparatus in all its parts, and shut the lid of the draftsman, which had been open until now. He climbed down, looked into the pit, and then at the condemned man, who, he was pleased to note, had taken out his clothes. The officer now went over to the pail of water to wash his hands, recognized the repulsive filth too late, felt sad that he could not wash his hands, finally plunged them into the sand. This surrogate did not satisfy him, but he had to make do. Then stood up and began unbuttoning his tunic. As he did so, the two ladies' handkerchiefs tucked under his collar fell into his hands. "Here are your handkerchiefs," he said, tossing them to the condemned man. And by way of explanation he told the traveler, "Gifts from the ladies." Despite his obvious haste in discarding his tunic and then stripping down, he handled every clothing item very lovingly. His fingers even purposely stroked the silver piping on his service coat, shaking a tassel into place. It was, however, inconsistent with this caution that as soon as he was done handling an item, he angrily flung it into the pit. The last remaining object was his short sword with its belt. He drew the sword from its sheath, smashed it, then gathered everything together, the sword fragments, the sheath, and the belt, and hurled them away so violently that they banged against each other in the pit. Now he stood there, naked. The traveler bit his lips and said nothing. He knew what was about to happen, but he had no right to hinder the officer in any way. If the judicial procedure that the officer revered was really on the verge of being eliminated, possibly because of the traveler's intervention, which he considered his duty, then the officer's action now was entirely correct. The traveler would have acted no differently in his place. At first, the soldier and the condemned man understood nothing. They were not even watching. The condemned man was delighted that he had gotten back the handkerchiefs, but he could not delight in them for long because the soldier snatched them from him quickly and unforeseeably. Now the condemned man tried to pull them out from behind the soldier, who had stowed them in his belt, but the soldier was alert. Thus they fought half playfully. It was only when the officer was stark naked that they noticed him. The condemned man in particular seemed struck by an inkling of some great sudden change. What had happened to him before was now happening to the officer. Perhaps he would go all the way. The foreign traveler had probably given the order. So this was revenge. Without having suffered to the end, he would nevertheless be avenged to the end. A broad, soundless grin now appeared on his face and did not vanish. The officer, however, had turned to the machine. If it had been plain earlier that he quite understood the machine, it was now almost staggering to see him running it and the machine obeying him. His hand merely approached the harrow, and the harrow rose and dropped several times until it was in just the right position for receiving him. He merely touched the edge of the bed, and it already began quivering. The felt stump came toward his mouth. They saw that the officer did not really want to have it, but his qualms lasted only an instant. He promptly yielded and took it in. Everything was ready. Only the straps still hung down the sides. But they were obviously unnecessary. The officer did not have to be strapped in. Now the condemned man noticed the loose straps. To his mind, the execution was incomplete unless the straps were buckled in. He eagerly signaled the soldier, and they ran over to strap in the officer. The officer had already stretched out one foot to kick the crank that started the draftsman. Now he saw that the two men had come. He therefore pulled back his foot and allowed himself to be strapped in. But now his foot could not reach the crank. Neither the soldier nor the condemned man would find it, and the traveler was determined not to stir. It did not matter. Hardly were the straps tightened when the machine began working. The bed quivered, the needles danced on the skin, the harrow floated up and down. The traveler had been staring at it for a while when it struck him that a gear in the draftsman should have been squeaking. But everything was quiet. Not the slightest humming could be heard. Because of this stillness, the machine simply escaped all notice. The traveler peered over at the soldier and the condemned man. The condemned man was the livelier of the two. Everything about the machine interested him. He kept bending down or stretching out, constantly pointing his forefinger to show the soldier some detail. The traveler was annoyed. He was determined to see it through, but he would not have endured the sight of them for long. "Go home," he told them. The soldier might have been willing to do so, but the condemned man regarded the order as an out-and-out punishment. Clasping his hands, he begged to be left here. And when the traveler shook his head, refusing to give in, the condemned man actually knelt down. The traveler saw that orders were useless here. He decided to go across and drive the two men away. But then he heard a noise overhead, in the draftsman. He looked up. Was that cogwheel causing trouble after all? It was something else, however. Slowly, the lid of the draftsman surged and then clapped wide open. The cogs of a gear surfaced and rose. Soon the entire gear emerged. It was as if some tremendous force were squeezing the draftsman together, leaving no room for this gear. The gear turned all the way to the edge of the draftsman, fell down, trundled upright over a stretch of sand, and then lay flat. But now a further gear was already rising up above. It was followed by many others, large, small, and barely discernible ones. The same thing happened to all of them. Whenever the onlookers figured that the draftsman must be empty by now, a new, very large group appeared, rose, plummeted, trundled across the sand, and lay flat. During this process, the condemned man forgot all about the traveler's order. He was utterly absorbed in the gears. He kept trying to grab one, simultaneously urged the soldier to help him, but withdrew his hand in fright, for another gear would promptly follow, terrifying him, at least when it began rolling. The traveler, however, was alarmed. The machine was obviously falling to pieces. Its tranquil operation was deceptive. He felt he had to look after the officer, since he could no longer take care of himself. But while the tumbling cogwheels had monopolized his attention, he had failed to observe the rest of the machine. Now, however, when, after the final gear had left the draftsman, he bent over the harrow, he had a new and even harsher surprise. The harrow was not writing. It was only pricking. And the bed was not rolling the body. It was only lifting it, quivering against the needles. The traveler wanted to do something, perhaps stop the machine. This was no torture such as the officer was aiming for. It was full-blown murder. The traveler stretched out his hands. But the harrow with the forked-up body was already turning aside, which it normally did only in the 12th hour. The blood flowed in 100 streams, not mingled with water. The small water pipes had likewise failed this time. And now the very last element failed. The body did not separate from the long needles. It poured out its blood, but dangled over the pit without dropping. The harrow was about to return to its old position, but as if noticing that it had not yet freed itself of its burden, it remained above the pit. "Do something!" The traveler shouted at the soldier and the condemned man, and grabbed the officer's feet himself. He wanted to push against the feet, while the other two men grabbed the head at the opposite end, so that the officer could be eased off the needles. But the two men could not make up their minds to come. The condemned man even turned away. The traveler had to go over and violently shove them toward the officer's head. In so doing, he reluctantly saw the face of the corpse. It was as it had been in life. No sign of the promised redemption was perceptible. The officer had not found what all the others had found in the machine. His lips were squeezed tight. His eyes were open, with the same expression as in life. His gaze was calm and convinced. The point of the large iron spike had passed through the forehead. When the traveler, with the soldier and the condemned man behind him, reached the first few houses in the colony, the soldier pointed to one, saying, "That's the tea-house." On the ground floor of a house lay a deep, low, cavernous room with smoky walls and ceiling. It was open full breadth toward the street. Even though it barely differed from the colony's other houses, which, except for the commander's palatial headquarters, were all very decrepit, the tea-house nevertheless looked like a historic reminiscence to the traveler, and he felt the power of earlier times. He stepped closer, walked, followed by his companions, between the small unoccupied tables on the street in front of the tea-house, and breathed in the cool, dank air coming from the interior. "The old man is buried here," said the soldier. "The priest refused to let him lie in the cemetery. For a while they couldn't decide where to bury him. Finally they buried him here. The officer probably told you nothing about that, for naturally this is the thing he is most ashamed of. A few times he even tried to dig the old man up at night, but he was always chased away." "Where is the grave?" asked the traveler, unable to believe the soldier. Instantly both the soldier and the condemned man ran ahead of him, stretching out their hands toward the location of the grave. They took the traveler all the way to the back wall, where patrons were seated at several tables. They were probably dock workers, strong men with short, shiny black beards. None of them wore a jacket. Their shirts were ripped. They were poor, humiliated creatures. When the traveler approached, a few stood up, hugged the wall, and gazed at him. "He's a foreigner." The whispers circled the traveler. "He wants to look at the grave." They pushed aside one of the tables, underneath which there actually was a gravestone. It was a simple stone, low enough to be concealed under a table. It bore an inscription in very tiny letters. The traveler had to kneel down to read it. It said, "Here lies the old commander. His followers, who must remain anonymous now, have dug him this grave and set up the stone. There is a prophecy that the commander will be resurrected after a certain number of years and lead his followers from this house to reconquer the colony. Have faith and abide." Upon reading this and getting to his feet, the traveler saw the men standing around him, smiling as if they had read the inscription with him, had found it ridiculous, and were asking him to concur in their opinion. The traveler pretended not to notice. He distributed a few coins among them, waited until the table had been pushed back over the grave, left the tea-house, and headed toward the harbor. In the tea-house, the soldier and the condemned man had found acquaintances who held them back. But they must have soon shaken them off, for the traveler was still midway down the long stairway leading to the rowboats when they came running after him. They probably wanted to force the traveler to take them along in the last moment. While the traveler was below, negotiating with a ferryman to row him to the steamer, the two men dashed down the stairs, holding their tongues, for they did not dare shout. But by the time they arrived below, the traveler was already in the rowboat, and the ferryman was already casting off. They might have jumped into the boat, but the traveler pulled up a heavy, knotted rope from the floor and threatened them with it, thereby preventing them from jumping in.
This ends in the Penal Colony, the last in this collection by Franz Kafka, translated by Joachim Neugroschel and narrated by George Guidel.